trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command, that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. You know, this message here tonight it's a bit of a unique one for me. And the reason for it is I have this nerve disorder in my face. I get a special name for it, but it affects the nerve that runs down to the upper jaw. So when I get a flare-up, it's very, very, very painful. And I find that one of the things that helps relieve some of the pain is if I'm hanging upside down. Of course, that's not the easiest thing to do. So what I usually do is I'll lay face down, hanging over my bed, and I'll put one hand on the floor, and I'll basically be hanging upside down. I wrote this sermon in that position. I did all my studying, I did all my notes, and I wrote my final draft pretty much upside down. Hopefully it doesn't come out that way. I was able to look over it this past week, and I think that it's fine, and I don't feel as though I made any real mistakes, but it was a very, very challenging week. That was for certain. Anyways, you know, the 1920s in America began like an age of endless prosperity. You know, the construction industry took off, business flourished, and the stock market soared. You know, it seemed as though this would never end. And then came the great stock market crash in October of 1929. You know, the repercussions to the economy was unprecedented. You know, banks failed, businesses closed, and millions of Americans quickly found themselves out of work. And within 4 years, 15 million people had lost their jobs, which made up 30% of the workforce. You know, 20% of the nation's school children had already begun showing evidence of poor nutrition and lack of medical care. You know, desperation kicked in. Almost 250,000 young boys left their homes to wander the streets and beg for food. You know, nobody had money. You know, even skilled workers, business owners, successful farmers, and professionals of all kinds found themselves in severe economic difficulty. The number of husbands and fathers deserting their families increased dramatically. Many of the once happily married women were now left to provide for themselves and their own children. You know, many became homeless. Masses of families living in public parks became the norm. You know, local governments and independent charities could no longer provide even the minimal assistance that was needed. This convinced the majority of the American people that individuals could not by themselves provide adequately for hard times such as these. You know, many became convinced that some form of greater security should be provided by society. You know, throughout much of this, President Roosevelt focused on creating jobs for unemployed workers. And eventually, he backed the idea of federal aid for poor children and other dependent persons. And so by 1935, a national welfare system had been established for the first time in American history. You know, this was the beginnings of the American welfare system. It was a system that sought to help the truly needy by providing for them during hard times. Its original intention was good, and I doubt anyone knew what it would eventually develop into. You know, today there is a welfare system in every state. They each vary to some degree, but they each do help the truly needy in hard times. You know, unfortunately, they also get drained of resources by those who do not actually need the financial aid. You know, those who have learned how to cheat the system. You know, to some people, they see this system as a way of making a living. This has been the cause of numerous welfare reforms throughout the years. State and federal governments have tried to close up the loopholes and get healthy men off the system and back into full-time jobs. Now, one of the ways this is done is by having a more strict screening process for those applying for benefits. This helps to separate those who are truly needy from those who are just looking for a handout. The process helps, but in the end, someone has to decide who is eligible and who is not. And this is what we're going to talk about tonight: the qualifications for widows receiving financial aid. And certainly not just widows, but anyone who seeks aid from the church or from church members. During the first century, people did not have a welfare system or Social Security like we do. Family took care of family. When you got old, your children or your grandchildren provided for you. Now, that is, if you had children or grandchildren. Times were especially tough if you were a widow. And if you were a widow without children or grandchildren, you were completely at the mercy of others. Fortunately, God has always had a plan to provide for widows and the needy. He has always made provision for them. Whether that was gleaning fields in the Old Testament or receiving aid from the church in the New Testament. However, not all widows qualify for the church's help. And this is what Paul is going to set straight for Timothy here in this passage. He's going to explain to Timothy an effective screening process so the church will not be overburdened. Because the church could not afford to be drained by freeloaders any more than our welfare system can today. So with all this in mind, we'll consider our first point. When it comes to providing for those who appear to be in need, we must recognize those who actually need help. Verses 1 and 2. Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, with all purity. The church is a family, and it's important that believers treat one another as family. Timothy's youth would have naturally caused him to shy away from the older members. And this problem would have been compounded when you considered his timid and shy tendencies. But once again, Paul is not cutting him any slack. Timothy is expected to set aside any reluctance he might have toward others. He had an entire field of ministry in his congregation, and he could not afford to miss out on any ministry opportunity within the various age groups. He needed to treat the older members as though they were his own mother and father. A normal, mentally healthy person does not mistreat his aged mother or father. He loves them and wants what is best for them. He is willing to set aside any differences there might be and treat them kindly. This is the sort of attitude Timothy is being exhorted to. He needed to view the older church members like they were his own parents. Doing so would guarantee their appropriate treatment. For some of the older people, this would have been easy. There naturally would have been older church members that were kind, compassionate, and easy to get along with. But this would not always be the case. It is likely that there were a few older members who were not always easy to get along with. For a timid guy like Timothy, this might have tempted him to ignore them. But Paul commands Timothy later in verse 21 to do nothing with partiality. He could not choose to only associate himself with those whom he felt most comfortable with. He needed to break past his apprehensiveness. Then, of course, there was the issue of Timothy having to reprimand church members. Bringing correction upon individuals within the church was going to be necessary if Timothy was going to have an effective teaching and leading ministry. If there happened to ever be a situation where Timothy needed to correct an older man or woman, he needed to do so very carefully and very respectfully. this obviously would be a very delicate situation. Nobody likes to feel as though they're being disrespected, especially by someone much younger than themselves. Timothy needed to deal with the people under his leadership as individuals. He could not use the same method for dealing with youth that he would for the older members, or vice versa. Those who were of the same age as Timothy or younger needed to be treated as though they were his own brothers and sisters. And he must do so with purity. It was important that he view and treat the younger women as sisters. Doing so meant he needed to walk very carefully. He was going to be faced with many temptations, and he needed to know how to say no to sin. His ministry could not afford any sort of misconduct on his part. Verse 3, honor widows who are really widows. Paul is implying that only qualified widows should be given aid by the church. Therefore, widows were expected, at least in this passage, to meet two requirements for receiving aid. The church's resources could only stretch so far. So if a widow had other means for receiving help, then she needed to pursue that. Whether that was receiving help from her own children or other family members. A real widow here would be considered a widow who had no other means to support herself. No children or family that could help. For widows who had family, that responsibility would fall on them. The church could only afford to help the truly needy. As you read through the Old Testament, several things are seen over and over again. And one of those is how God has always taken care of widows. He has always had a concern for them, which is why he made provision for them in the law. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 17 to 21. You shall not pervert justice due to the stranger or the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this thing. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterward. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widows. Widows were permitted to glean the fields after harvest. This allowed them to go out and pick from the leftovers, and which in those days, and with their rather inefficient reaping methods, they had a tendency to leave a lot behind. This was sort of a welfare system, except the widows were required to go out into the fields to gather the leftovers. So there was a measure of work involved. This system differed greatly from our modern systems of welfare. The system also did not harm the income of the farmers. They were only commanded to not go back into their fields after the harvest to gather leftovers, because this would have been time-consuming anyway. In the Old Testament and within the Jewish economy, God looked out for the widows. As we can see here in the New Testament, God is still caring for the widows. Only this time he does it through the church. Verse 4, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents. For this is good and acceptable before God. If a widow had children or grandchildren, it was their responsibility to care for their widowed mother or grandmother, not the church. The family of a widow was expected to provide for her. Now, whether that was providing a room or food or clothing, in a sense, they would be repaying her. To her own children, she raised them up and took care of them. The least they could do at this point was to take care of her. She met their needs when they were unable to, So it only makes sense that they return the favor. To her grandchildren, she raised their parents and likely helped to some degree raising the grandchildren. The least they could do was take care of her in her time of need. To not do so was a very selfish thing. Honor your father and your mother. It's one of the 10 Commandments. This not only means to obey them and treat them with respect, it also means that we must care for them when they get older. Doing so is good and acceptable before God. That is what he intends for us to do. Verse 5, now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. See, this is what qualifies a widow for receiving support from the church. And number one, she's left alone, meaning she has no family that can support her. No children or grandchildren who are alive and well enough to care for her. There wasn't much work available for an elderly woman during the first century. It's not as though she could search the classifieds for a job, go to the unemployment office, or collect financial aid from the government. If she had no family to support her, then she would be without resources. At this point, her only means for sustenance would have to come through the church. And this is what Paul has in mind. This is the type of widow who truly needs help from the church. She's obviously not simply looking for a handout. Now, the other thing that qualifies her is that she is also a very godly woman. She has real character and has a genuine interest in helping other believers. She is faithful. She trusts God for her salvation as well as her material needs. She has a servant's heart. She desires and is willing to serve the church in any capacity that she can. In this circumstance, she is called to a ministry of prayer. She is to spend time praying for the people in her church, as well as praying for the salvation of those outside the church. That is her service in her local assembly of believers. We've looked at the legitimate case for helping widows. They're the widows who have no other means for support. They're also godly. They're also willing to serve. As we consider our second point, we look at those who should not be supported. It's important that we recognize those who just want handouts. Verse 6, but she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. You could translate that, the widow who indulges in luxurious, sinful living, though physically alive, is spiritually dead. A widow who lives a sinful, immoral, ungodly life is alive physically, but her lifestyle would indicate that she is most likely dead spiritually. It is all too common for someone to profess faith in Christ, but to consistently live for the devil. A widow living in sin is disqualified from receiving assistance. Now bear in mind, that's not describing the Christian who has a legitimate struggle with sin. Paul is describing a woman who consistently lives in sin. For that woman, there is no struggle. She simply lives in sin, and she lives for pleasure. This is the lifestyle that is in view here. As one commentator said, the life lived for mere pleasure and ease is no life at all. It is a living death, whether lived by a young widow or anyone else. Many who come to the church for assistance are in need because they have lived their lives for the pleasures of alcohol, drugs, or whatever. Now they are in need and they want the church to help. The fact of the matter is that these people have lived for the pleasures of sin. And now that their lifestyle has caught up with them, they seek help. This is the kind of widow that Paul is referring to. She is the type of woman who has lived a life without restraint. And now she is met with the consequences. You see, this is not the type of widow that Paul is admonishing Timothy to help support. These widows have lived their lives for sin. At this point, they are likely very hard-hearted, and they would likely have no desire to serve the church in any capacity. These women are simply looking for a handout. Back in verse 5, this describes a widow with much different characteristics than verse 6 does. Verse 5 describes a widow who has lived a godly life and desires to continue serving the church. This is the type of widow that the church needed to support. This was considered using the church's resources wisely. To waste resources on an immoral woman was not a wise use of money. Verse 7, and these things command that they may be blameless. Paul here, I believe, is referring to verses 3 through 6, and how and who the church must care for. That is why he lays out some requirements for helping widows. This is what Timothy needed to teach and enforce. As a pastor or leader of the Ephesian believers, it was Timothy's responsibility to teach and command these things to be done. And this is how the members could know what God expects of them. Verse 8, but if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. This is likely referring to the children or grandchildren of a widow who are likely professing Christians. These are people who have an obligation to help their own family member in need, but are unwilling to. It's not that they don't have the ability or the resources to help. It's that they simply won't help. They don't even have enough love and respect for their family member to care for them like they should. And whether that's because they're just lazy or greedy, and the fact is they won't help. And they are expecting the church to step up and fulfill their own obligation. Now, as I said before, the church does not necessarily have enough resources to help all these widows. And they shouldn't have to if some of them have family that could support them. The type of person Paul is referring to is an individual who professes to know Christ, but shows his true colors when asked to live it out. It's not a lot to ask a man to take care of his family, especially when he has the means to do so. When that's his own family within his own household. That would include his wife and children and all who live under his roof that he is responsible for. To not do so is worse behavior than an unbeliever. The unbeliever by nature knows that he is responsible to take care of his family. That comes from a conscience and from natural affection. But he does so in ignorance of God's instruction to him. But the so-called believer who is unwilling to do the things he knows he should do actually commits a worse sin in his negligence than the unbeliever does in his ignorance. And this makes him worse than an unbeliever. The point is, we will all be held accountable for what we do with our resources. We are expected to provide for those whom we are responsible for. To not do so would be an act of defiance. If you live long enough, you will eventually meet individuals and perhaps even whole families that appear to be in financial need. And I know that the temptation is often to give them what they seek. It's only natural to feel as though that is our obligation. But this passage would indicate that that is not always the case. To give money or resources to everyone who asks does not necessarily make us good stewards. The fact of the matter is that in some instances, the best thing we can do is not offer a handout. Some people just need to be encouraged to go to work and earn their own bread. In conclusion, being a good steward, number one, means we cannot be greedy with what God has blessed us with. But it also means we must not be so naive that we give our money to whomever. The fact of the matter is we just don't know the intentions of the heart of everyone who seeks help. And all we can do is screen them to the best of our ability and try to make the wisest judgment that we can. See, that is what we learn from this passage. We are called to be wise with our resources, also generous with our giving, but discerning with our contributions. Those are the makings of good stewardship, and that should be our aim. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for your word. I do thank you for this passage. Lord, I do pray that we'll all be very generous people, but also very discerning. I certainly know that it's all too common for men who we know are able to work, are able to provide for their own, but choose not to, and prey on churches and individuals. We certainly know that that's wrong. We certainly do pray that those men will be convicted of what they've done. They'll be convicted that they need to work and earn their own bread. I certainly do pray that we will be generous, that when we do see a legitimate need by someone who has, who truly needs help and is not just simply looking for a handout, I do pray that we'll be giving and not greedy. Certainly that would be a very terrible thing for us to do. Certainly do pray for widows. Do pray for the widows who we know through other churches. Certainly pray, Lord, that you continue to look after them, take care of them.